Perfect. All right. So what we're going to do today is kind of just try to use the Zoom session as more or less what we would do normally in class. That's at least my hope, is just treat this sort of like another class session. Everyone's starting off as muted, just so there's no feedback or anything. But you can send me questions either in the chat, but also you should all have the ability to unmute yourself. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question if you've got one. There aren't that many of us that should be a problem, I don't think, especially when I'm on the whiteboard, which I'll be for a lot of today, because it takes me longer to see the chat when I'm there. So just interrupt me, unmute yourself, and just ask a question. Please don't hesitate from that. And we'll sort of use this the same way we would a class session. We'll go through the week 14 in-class activity, get it turned in by the end of the day, and that'll be sort of the plan. The way the rest of the semester is going to look, this is actually our last class session of the semester. I hope you enjoyed the break. I hope you enjoyed the Thanksgiving break. I'll just speak for myself. I wish it had been longer. I could have used a little bit more of a break myself. So we'll get a little bit of one, though. This is the last time we'll meet. Next week, we won't meet on next Friday. I will be available that day. If anyone wants this to do kind of like impromptu office hours or whatever, we can sort of schedule something in for that time to go over, study for the exam, get ready for it. But there'll be no new class sessions after this one. So you're done. You're at the end, and no assignments besides the final exam. That'll be the only thing that's left. The final exam will cover Chapter 6, what we covered right before the break with the inductive statistical arguments. And then lastly, it'll cover what we're going to talk about today, the Chapter 11 stuff. The reason we're going to end the semester at Chapter 11 is that I'm hoping it'll kind of give a nice little symmetry to the course, kind of take us back to where we started at least. We began the semester talking about this idea of inquiry, right? This sort of project of searching for truth with sort of no other motivation other than to figure out what's true. Right? We all take ourselves to be irrational. We all take ourselves to have good reasons to believe the things that we believe. And so this project of inquiry is how we sort of figure out if we're right and correct ourselves if we're not, right? Not letting any other sort of motivations slip in and mess us up. But we noted from the very beginning of the semester that's kind of an idealist project in a lot of respects, right? We don't have to go super far to find lots of people who really just don't seem to care very much about what's true or false in the first place, right? They're saying things for other reasons. They're not trying to figure out what's true. They're trying to maybe manipulate us or whatever. And again, we don't have to go far to find this. Go to Twitter, go to Facebook, turn on the news. You'll find examples of this frequently. But we also found that it's not just bad faith actors. There's also people who are in good faith trying to inquire successfully, and things still go wrong, right? Things still don't work out, even though everyone's sort of trying to. Everyone's trying to do their best. Everyone's working hard at it. It still just doesn't work for whatever reason. And we saw that with one way we saw that, and we've been talking about that so far in the semester, is in terms of logical fallacies, right? That there are certain kinds of logical mistakes, purely logical mistakes that people can make that can kind of cause them to go wrong in some respects, cause things to go wrong in the conversation, cause the inquiry to get off on the wrong foot. But it's very rare that logical mistakes occur in an isolation. Some of the fallacies we talked about, they're so obvious that you almost would be like, why would someone ever make that mistake in the first place, almost, right? And the reason is because other stuff is going on too, right? There are what we're going to call today biases of various sorts, features of how our brains work, features of our emotional lives, features of our social lives that also can interfere with inquiry in some cases. They're not all necessarily bad, but at least in some cases, they can lead to bad consequences in terms of inquiry. What we want to end the semester with is sort of looking at how these things too can kind of interfere with inquiry, and then start practicing seeing how they connect a little bit to the logical fallacies. So we can start sort of moving out of the logic classroom to being logical in the real world, right? And in the real world, just telling someone, hey, that's the slippery slope fallacy, hurdy, her, that's not going to go very well, right? That's not going to go over great. That's not going to persuade anyone, right? So how can we still recognize that the slippery slope fallacy was committed, but do something productive with that, make something good at it? We'll try to do that today using Chapter 11 kind of as our guide. So I think that's pretty much all I have in terms of starting. Your final exam for you all will be on Wednesday. You'll have the entire day to do it. So the window will be the whole day. And my guess is it's not finished, but I'm guessing it'll be about an hour long, is about how long you'll have to do it. So yeah, I'll have office hours and stuff, and we can go over that if anyone wants to. Otherwise, unless anyone has any sort of initial thoughts, comments, or questions, we can just turn to the week 14 in class activity.
What's the weight of the final?
So the final, it's a good question. So it's basically just another exam. It'll be worth a little bit more, but that's just because it'll be covering 3 weeks of material instead of 2. So, whatever that would come to. So slightly more than the other exams, but just because it covers more material, not for any other reason.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And by the way, perhaps related to that thought, if you go to the week 14 post-class activities portion of the module, you'll find 2 handouts that are sort of like study guide kind of handouts. One of them is a list of all of the biases that we're going to talk about today. And the other one is a list of all of the fallacies that are sort of fair game for the exam. That'll be the main cumulative thing, is we'll be bringing in fallacies from earlier in the semester. So you might find that list helpful. You might even find it helpful today when we're going through this activity. You might find it helpful during the homework studying. You can even use it on the exam itself too. That's sort of, it just let you know exactly what fallacies I could quiz you on. Good. Any other questions? All right, awesome. Then let's start with the week 14 in-class activity. So there's going to be 2 kinds of questions on it. The first kind of questions are basically what the first 6 are all examples of the first ones. In the first 6, all we need to do is just identify what bias is being committed. Or is not being even committed exactly, as you don't commit them, but what bias is being maybe manifested or demonstrated by some exchange. And then 1 or 2 sentences where you sort of explain why you see that bias as being present within it. So let's do this first one together first, and then I'll give you a few minutes to work on them individually. So first one, we've got the belief in the existence of God is plainly irrational. There are numerous arguments that can be made to prove that God does not exist, given by notable philosophers and physicists. What do those who believe in God have to offer? Just blind faith. Okay. All right, here, if we wanted to, we could characterize this argument as committing a logical fallacy. Right? We could say this is sort of the straw person fallacy. At least many people who are religious have a lot more to offer than blind, quote unquote, faith. Right? What does blind faith mean? It means sort of faith without reasons. But I can tell you myself, I teach medieval philosophy and I teach philosophy of religion here at CSU. And I can tell you, there are a lot of arguments made by philosophers, physicists, and indeed theologians that argue that God does indeed exist, or that we have good reasons to believe that God exists. Right? And so this could be, we could characterize this kind of as the straw person fallacy. The person making this argument just as misrepresenting the reasons people who believe in God would offer in defense of their belief of God. But there's also more going on than just that. It seems as if this person is just not aware. So we assume this person is probably an atheist or agnostic of some sort. This person just seems to not actually really be aware of why people who are religious are religious. I mean, and that's the sense of blind faith again, like faith without reason or something, faith without any argument or justification to it. They just sort of like, that has to be why, because I can't think of any reasons why they would actually believe what they believe. That is an example of what we're going to call the my side bias. So you can treat this a little bit like, sort of like how you write it out, almost as if you were explaining why it's a fallacy. Tell me what the bias is and how the bias is being committed in this specific exchange, or how the bias is being manifested in a specific exchange. So the my side bias is our tendency to just not really be aware of why people who disagree with us believe what they believe. And, you look at this particular example, again, I assume the person making this argument is probably an agnostic or an atheist or something. Why are they an atheist or an agnostic? Well, probably because they heard these various arguments that God doesn't exist from these philosophers and these physicists, right? That's probably why. If they had heard good arguments for why God does exist, maybe they would believe God existed. Right? They're just not aware of those things. That's naturally going to lead to the straw person fallacy. Then it's going to lead you to sort of misrepresent the views of people who don't agree with you, kind of because you just don't know what it is they say. Right? And the result of this bias, at least when it goes sort of wrong, is we then tend to dismiss people who disagree with us as being irrational. because we just don't know their reasons. We don't know why they think what they think. And this very clearly what's taking place in this particular inquiry, right, or this particular exchange. The speaker is not aware of arguments that people have made to suggest that God does exist. And so assumes that there's just blind faith to support the view. All right, and so this is the kind of thing you should be doing with all of these questions, basically. Maybe not. Maybe this is maybe even longer than a little bit longer than you need to do, but something like this. What's the bias being committed? What is that bias? And then sort of how is it specifically being manifested in the given argument? So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments on this number one? All right, great. Then why don't we turn to number two? Why don't you take a minute or so, look through number two, and try to do this. See if you can identify what bias is being manifested, and then give a brief little account of why. All right, so let's start talking about this one. So again, if we wanted to, we could characterize this argument in terms of logical fallacies. Indeed, a logical fallacy is being committed here. In this case, we could say it's sort of the anecdotal evidence fallacy. You could sort of read this as kind of a generalization of a certain sort, right? That poverty in general doesn't harm people's successfulness in life or hurt people from being successful in life. And the evidence that's being presented in favor of that generalization is this one individual person's experience. Okay, anecdotal evidence fallacy. Fine, we can characterize it that way. Indeed, that's fine, right? But why is the anecdotal evidence fallacy being committed here? Well, here I would say this is an example of what's called the representative bias. And so what is this bias? This is our tendency of how our brains work, actually. Right? And it's a tendency to assume that other people's experiences are more or less the same as our experiences. Now, this isn't a bad thing at all. In a lot of cases, this is really useful, right? If I touch something hot and it hurts my hand, and I say, hey, don't touch it, the reason I'm giving you that warning is because I assume you're going to have the same experience that I had of touching it, right? We'll have the same negative experience, and so that's why I can sort of warn you. So this is not at all a bad thing necessarily, but it can lead us to go wrong in some cases, right? And where that happens is where I tend to dismiss experiences that are really different from my own. It's not that my own experience isn't relevant or whatever, but people whose experiences are different than mine, I assume that something's just gone wrong with them, right? Because my assumption is that everyone's experiences are basically the same as mine. And so that, again, that would very obviously, in a lot of cases, lead to a kind of anecdotal evidence fallacy, right? Over privileging one's own experiences. And that we see that as what's taking place here, right? Many people have probably had very different experiences with poverty. And the speaker's just sort of like dismissing that fact or ignoring that fact. All right, so how are people feeling about number two? Any questions, comments? Also, feel free if you thought there was maybe another bias at play. It will be the case sometimes that there could be more than one answer in some cases. So if you thought maybe another bias was at play too, maybe throw that out there as well, and we can discuss that to see if you're right. So any questions, comments, thoughts? This second one. All right, great. Let's turn to number 3 then. All right. So this was actually a real world example. I was listening to a podcast with a woman who was in her 60s, who was one of the very first newspaper editors, female newspaper editors back in the early 70s. And she was saying in the course of this podcast that she was doing this interview, and she was like, "Yeah, like it's really important that women dress a certain sort of way, right? The same way that we dressed when I was coming up, or whatever." And so you could maybe characterize this as a kind of argument. Maybe we could maybe call this maybe the fallacy of popularity, to just assume that sort of just because a lot of people do something, it's right or something like that. But again, there's more going on than just that logical mistake as well. There's what's called, this is a social bias, a function of how groups work, inside the box thinking. And this bias is a tendency of the people within a group basically to forget that the customs or traditions present within a group are indeed customs and traditions. And so you can think of this, it's sort of like, there's all kind of what we mean by a group in terms of the social biases. It could be anything. So, maybe if you celebrated Thanksgiving with your family, you probably had various traditions that you carried out. But also, if you're working in an office, that office, there's probably sort of traditions, customs, ways that people habitually tend to behave. That just as readily counts as sort of a group. The danger of inside the box thinking is to sort of take those customs or traditions, which aren't in themselves bad at all, and to see them as sort of as if they're sort of necessary, as if they're unchangeable, as if they're obvious, as if they're things that don't require any justification in and of themselves. Right? So sort of forget that they are just customs and traditions, and you could have other customs and traditions too. And that's what we see here, right? The fact that certain dress standards existed in the past doesn't really mean that those things couldn't be justified or changed. This is sort of a way almost of sort of like not being willing to start an inquiry, because almost like you don't see something as being the kind of thing that's worth inquiring about. We have to do it this way, right? This is obviously the right thing to do. It's become so obvious to you that you forget that it could actually be different, and so therefore requires justification in some context, at least in the context of an inquiry. So yeah, this is what I have for number 3. Does anyone have, again, any questions, thoughts, comments for this one? All right, then let's turn to number 4. Here's another example. Again, I guess if you wanted to, you could maybe characterize this as a fallacy. Maybe this is like the straw person fallacy. I guess like person A didn't say any of that maybe, but like, again, that almost seems as if it's beside the point. Like, what's the problem here? The problem is the defensiveness bias, right? That person B is showing. And so what is this bias? This is a tendency to interpret criticism or critique as a personal attack, even when it actually isn't. And sometimes it is, but in this case, it fairly obviously isn't. What's person A actually talking about? Person A is talking about evidence, the conclusion, and a paper, right? The world. And does that relate back to the person who wrote the paper? Sure, presumably that's why they're talking about it. But nevertheless, what person A is talking about is not person B. They're talking about the paper. Person B is interpreting critique of the paper as a personal attack, as if it was talking about them. And so basically this just short circuits any possibility of actually having an inquiry into the actual topic, which is the paper good? Does the evidence actually support the conclusion or not? And that's what we see here. And yeah, if this is going to be someone's attitude, inquiry is not going to work. We're never going to get anywhere. We're not even really going to start inquiring because we're never going to be able to actually address the issue, which is really not really the person. Right? And so that's how defensiveness can be sort of this disastrous. It basically stops the inquiry before it can even begin. All right. Anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments on number 4? All right, great. Let's turn to number 5 then. All right. So here we see what's called ideological fixity. And so let's just define what we mean by an ideology first before we even get into the fixity. So basically all I mean by an ideology is just some framework for interpreting the world. And in and of itself, that's not a bad thing, actually. The frameworks for interpreting the world can be really, really useful, and we rely upon frameworks to help us navigate the world all the time. So that in and of itself isn't the problem. The problem is adopting the framework when this becomes a bias, and then sort of basically just to apply that framework in all circumstances, even circumstances where it's not applicable. So why is this a danger to inquiry? This is a danger to inquiry because you're not actually going to inquire. If someone who does this, someone who always applies the same framework in all circumstances, regardless of the situation, they're not going to actually inquire because they already know the answer before they started. Do you think that basically that's the danger of ideological fixity, is it makes it such that we act as if we know answers to questions before we even ask the question in the first place. And so then there's no need to actually inquire or to investigate, right? I mean, we can make this like more concrete, right? Like you can't actually inquire into whether the framework is appropriate if you're just assuming that it is. Whereas, our ideological frameworks are themselves things that can be investigated and require justification, right? Why is this the right way of approaching this particular situation? And what we see here in person B is adopting, you could call it sort of like maybe a hawkish foreign policy ideology. And feels no need to justify why that ideology is actually the right one to apply in this particular international crisis. When indeed that would precisely be the thing that the inquiry would have to be about. Why is this the right way of responding in this particular circumstance? All right, how people feeling about number 5? Any questions, thoughts, comments? You could maybe call this a desire for certainty as well. It's not quite as strong, but there is a sense in which person B just sort of seems to like want to think that they've gotten the whole foreign policy thing figured out. Maybe but I think ideological fixity is a little bit stronger because it kind of explains the way in which they're looking for certainty is through this ideology. All right.
Could it be considered as like overconfidence bias as well?
Could be considered as overconfidence bias. So I imagine you're thinking something like maybe it's overconfidence insofar as the person like just feels more strongly about it than they should based on the evidence.
Yeah.
Usually, that's not bad. I can see why you'd want to go that way. Usually, with overconfidence bias, we'd have to sort of have what evidence they're looking at.
Okay.
Because we'll see an example of overconfidence bias a little bit later. That's usually going to be like, I'm just more confident than I should be based on the evidence. So we sort of like need to know what the evidence is that would be leading them to come to the conclusion to usually want to say that it's overconfidence bias.
Okay. Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, you're certainly not wrong to say that probably whatever evidence person B would actually in the real world have for this ideology, yeah, they're probably being too overconfident in it. That's probably it also going on in a real world case, certainly. Good. Any others? All right, then we have one last example of this first kind of problem. So why don't you turn to number 6? We'll do that one, and then we'll look at some more complicated problems afterwards. All right. So here we see, I think, a better example, at least, of the overconfidence bias. Actually, so yeah, this is a good one to bring up prior to this discussion. Because yeah, what we see here, so what is the overconfidence bias? This is our tendency to either, there's sort of two options, to either one, to be more confident that some belief is true than is actually supported by the evidence. So that sort of matches how you are reading the last case. Or to hold a more extreme version of some belief than that the evidence actually supports. And in this case, it's more the second one. This is more of an extreme version of the belief than is actually supported, right? We can sort of break it down, like sort of, what does the evidence actually suggest here? The evidence suggests that drinking too much coffee, and again, notice too much coffee is quite a bit, 8 cups, right? Too much coffee might be a little dangerous, so maybe cut back a little bit. All right, and the person concludes from that coffee is going to kill you. Right? So that's a more extreme version of the belief. The belief is that coffee, like too much coffee, might be a little bit dangerous, so try to cut back. The version that the person actually adopts, person A adopts, is coffee will kill you. And so then, yeah, they're being overconfident. They're drawing more out of the study than it actually demonstrates. And the reason why this tendency actually, again, this is another one that in some cases isn't necessarily even a problem. This emerges kind of because when humans act in the world, our actions kind of have to be all or nothing, right? Like if I have like some coffee in front of me, I'm either going to drink it or I'm not going to drink it, right? And it sort of has to be one of, I can't like half drink, maybe I can half drink a cup of coffee or something, but I can't like half drink and half not drink some coffee. I'm going to either drink it or I'm not going to drink it. And practically that's fine, but our beliefs don't have to have that all or nothing character. I can not drink some cup of coffee, but not drink it because I recognize that there's a chance that maybe too much coffee would be dangerous, a more nuanced view than the action itself will be. So is that I hope that was helpful, both in terms of how the last one doesn't quite work as well with overconfidence bias, and also that it makes sense in this context too. So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments? All right, great. So a lot of the questions that you're going to get in the exam are going to be very similar to the ones we've just gone over. So you'll just be given in some exchange. You'll have to say what bias you sort of think is present within the exchange, and then give a sentence or two like I just did, where you sort of justify your answer, right? So maybe, what is the bias? How do you see it? Something like that. Maybe those, you'll probably have like 3-4 minutes per those questions. That they shouldn't be super, super long ones. But there's also going to be some questions that are a bit more complicated. And those are what the last 3 ones on the activity are going to be examples of those. In the actual real world, like we talked about earlier today, the fallacies and the biases tend to go together. And so to actually respond to an instance of a logical fallacy, you usually also have to be responding to the bias that's sort of motivating it and leading someone to go in the direction of that fallacy in the first place. We've sort of seen with a lot of these fallacies, a lot of them are sort of so, if you think about it, so obviously wrong that it's almost like, why would someone ever think this in the first place? Well, it's usually because something else is going on, because one of these biases is actually also present and it's interfering with their reasoning in some concrete case. So the more complicated problems in the exam, you're going to need to do 3 things. So first, you need to identify what fallacy is committed in some argument, and then, brief 1 sentence why. 2, you need to identify also what bias is being manifested within the conversation. Again, maybe 1 quick sentence why. And then 3, come up with some response that addresses both the logical fallacy and the bias, not just one or the other, that sort of responds to both of them. Let's turn now to the last group of questions, so 7, 8, 9. Why don't you take a minute or so, look at 7, see if you can identify both the bias and the fallacy that's committed within it. We'll maybe do the response together, and then we'll give you some chances to go through 8 and 9 on your own too. All right. So what is our logical fallacy? Just start here. Start with the fallacy. We have the slippery slope fallacy. It's very unlikely that taking care of a crying child is going to lead to them ending up in prison. Indeed, it's so unlikely you'd almost wonder why someone would ever bring it up in the first place. But we can see, why did they bring it up in the first place? They brought it up because of this experience in their past that seems as if it made a strong impact on them, right? The experience of their brother being spoiled and it, leading to the brother ending up in jail, maybe in some causal sense, and this being a really strong, painful experience in the person's past. Giving that experience too much weight would be the result of the availability and vividness bias. The powerful and painful experience of the speaker's brother ending up in jail and being spoiled as a kid is being given just too much evidentiary weight. Because of how powerful it was, because of what a profound and vivid experience this was in the person's life. And so just pointing out, like, well, this is the slippery slope fallacy, hurdy, her, right? Like, that's not going to go very far, because the reason why the person is making that mistake isn't actually being addressed. And so maybe what could a more productive response look like? Maybe something like this. Again, there's lots of different things you could write down here, but it's just an example. Maybe something like this maybe is a better response, right? I know the experience with your brother was really, really painful for you. And it is really important that we not spoil our child. But just taking care of him when he cries isn't going to spoil him. And it won't lead him to ending up like your brother did. This is a more productive kind of response. It does indeed address the logical fallacy, right? Basically, what's being said here is this conclusion is the conclusion is not likely to follow from the premises. Slippery slope fallacy, fine, right? But it also sort of like acknowledges why the person is making the mistake. I know you had this experience. That experience matters. It's meaningful evidence, right? But don't give it too much importance. Don't overweigh it. That's way more likely to get a better response, to get the conversation reoriented in a productive direction, than just being like the smart aleck on the internet who's just like, yeah, that's a logical fallacy. Ha ha ha. So, all right, so here'll be an example of the kind of thing I'd be going to be looking for these more complicated questions. Does anyone have any other questions about 7? Questions, thoughts, comments? All right, let's turn to 8. All right. So if any of you are Office fans, I sort of always think of this example as the Michael Scott example from The Office, right? Okay, so what we obviously see a logical fallacy here. This is the red herring fallacy. The company's product and customer service, or maybe the quality of those things, that's just irrelevant to the question of the employee raises. And it's just a distraction tactic, right? It's just a way of sort of shifting focus away from you're not going to get any raises this year to talking about a whole bunch of stuff that's not really relevant to the raises. Okay, so why could this red herring fallacy being committed? Well, okay, sometimes it might be being committed strategically. Someone might be using it to quite deliberately try to trick their employees or get their employees to go along with things that are against their best interests, something like that. But in this case, it looks like to me as if a little bit more is going on. We also seem to have here an example of what gets called identification with our beliefs. It seems really important to the manager that people think that he's a good manager and that the company is a good company. And that because of that, they sort of just don't want to look or acknowledge things that suggest that either of those things aren't true. Like, for example, that you haven't given your employees raises in 5 years. Right? And so a good response will need to address sort of both sides of it. And so maybe something like this could be effective, right? If the company is as good as you say that it is, then shouldn't the employees get raises in recognition of their good work? And there's sort of like a double value to this response. It responds to the fallacy. It reorients the conversation away from the irrelevant details back to what was actually relevant, which was the raises. But it also sort of like is trying to get as much as possible, at least the manager, to sort of almost recognize the cognitive dissonance that's occurring between their image of themselves as this good manager and this good company and the reality that the employees aren't getting raises despite perhaps the good work that's being done and raises that are deserved. So again, you sort of hit both sides of the fallacy's emergence. Again, any questions, thoughts, comments on 8? All right, let's do the last one, number 9. All right. So again, another case is we have a very clear fallacy here. This is the post hoc fallacy. All right. The person's only justification for why the bird caused the computer to crash is that the bird flew by before the computer crashed. But a bird flying by is not a credible cause for why a computer might crash. Right. So, okay. And again, this is an example, I think, where like it seems like really obvious that that's the case. So why have things gone wrong here? We should look for some other explanation about why this fallacy is being committed. And here we see an example of the confirmation bias. Right. Confirmation bias is our tendency to only look for evidence or to only accept evidence that confirms what we already believe. And in this case, that's very clearly what we see here. Person A is only looking at times that they've encountered animals where something bad happened. As those memories are the only ones that confirm their hypothesis that animals are bad luck. And so again, whatever response we come up with here, it's not going to be enough to say that's the post hoc fallacy. We're also going to have to try to overcome the confirmation bias as best as we can. So maybe something like this, but you've had plenty of experiences with animals where nothing bad happened. Right? And if you presumably you know the person, so maybe listen, maybe like, you know, tell them, remind them. Right. It's the cases you mentioned are just coincidences. Just like with the bird. And again, we get both sides of it. We point out this is just a coincidence. That's basically when you're accusing something of being the post hoc fallacy. It's basically what you're saying. That's just a coincidence. But we also are trying to get the person to overcome the confirmation bias, to remember evidence that indeed would support the theory that it's just a coincidence against their superstition. Right. And so by trying to get them to look at other evidence, we're trying to work against the confirmation bias that's present. All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments about number 9? All right. So I'd like to thank all of you for your great work this semester. This has been a super weird, frustrating, difficult semester in a whole bunch of different ways. There's lots of, this is not the way I would have ideally preferred to have taught this class, certainly. But thank you for putting in sort of the good work and the good effort up to this point. We'll try to finish strong, last little bit. Also, it looks like next semester is going to look pretty similar to this semester, at least that's the current plan anyway. So I'll be teaching another of these sort of hybrid logic classes in the spring. As a result, I'd really love to hear from all of you. I usually love hearing from students, but even more than usual in terms of things like the course surveys and stuff that should be available. I'd love to hear from you what worked, what didn't work, what could be done better, how could this work with all the other challenges going on in your life in a better way. I've never taught a class like this before, so I really value any feedback you can give me about how to improve it going forward. So that would be incredibly helpful. Next week, I'll post one more video, one sort of last video for the semester. We'll sort of just wind up the semester a little bit, do some big picture stuff. I'll talk a little bit about the exam. I'll probably post that maybe on Wednesday or so. We won't have any class. And after that, we'll just have office hours. We can do whatever people want to go over the exam together. Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your semester. Have a great break. Don't hesitate to get in touch with me if there's anything I can do for you. And I can stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to chat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You as well.